Welcome to By the Well with me, Fran Barber.
And me, Robin Whittaker.
We're recording this from home again on Zoom because it's still stage 4 here in Melbourne. So we apologise in advance if the sound quality is not up to the usual standard or if you hear occasionally domestic noises in the background. We give great thanks to Adrian Jackson for all his digital support in this new way of delivering the podcast, and also the Uniting Church and Pilgrim Theological College.
So our readings for today that we're focusing on are Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, the story of the burning bush, and Matthew 16, 21 to 28. And we're going to begin with Matthew, Fran.
Yeah, so we've come in the middle of a story, really. So last week we heard that Peter received the keys to the kingdom and he made his great declaration of Jesus' identity. What we have here, and I did refer, well, I particularly, I think last time, did refer to this passage briefly last week, because what it really is essentially is Peter gets it wrong. His first move with these keys and this new power and this privilege and honour is to completely overreach and deny the church its true Lord by saying no, rebuking Jesus and saying, no, that's outrageous, you can't be going to Jerusalem, you are not to be dying. So that's the background, immediate background to today's passage. That's the teaching really in Matthew that suffering and death is integral to this messiahship.
Yeah, which this is old territory for those of you who've been preaching for a while, but is a fairly radical reimagining of that messianic role, which would have come with a certain amount of royal expectation. The Messiah is associated with the son of David, with the royal line, that promise to David that there'll always be some sort of king of Israel, and in some texts with a kind of a warrior Messiah that will really reclaim Israel as a nation against foreign occupying forces. So for Jesus to start talking about the necessity of suffering and dying in Jerusalem
and on a cross,
which is shameful
and criminal, is scandalous, as Paul actually did at some point.
It is a scandal. It's an offence. So we get that famous line of Jesus rebuking Peter with the "Get behind me, Satan."
The last time Jesus rebuked, I think, was the storm.
Yes. He rebuked the storms. He rebukes demons sometimes. And, of course, Satan immediately echoes those temptation narratives. So this sense that Peter is perhaps, embodying the temptation that Jesus also faces in those temptation stories way back in earlier chapters. The temptation to deny his true identity, to take an easier path.
Yeah, well, or to take on, in this, I suppose, immediate instance, what power in the world means.
Yes.
Rather than to reject that notion of power and take on this suffering.
The classic teaching here, Fran, I don't know, do you have any exegetical things you want to draw out?
Well, I had one because I think it's quite profound, strong imagery, and our colleague Sunny Chen every month runs Zoom sessions on the interesting Greek that might be coming up in the coming month of the lectionary, and I tuned in this week, and he did talk about, just in that first verse 21, Jesus began to show, and that the verb in Greek is really to expose the eyes, and it's a verb used only 3 times in the New Testament. Normally there's another word for show, which is daikomi, I think.
Yeah, daikonomy. Yep.
Daikonomy. That's used about 30 times. And so there's this incredible emphasis, Sonny was suggesting, in this particular use of Greek, expose your eyes. And then to put that alongside the he must go, the necessity, in the Greek, he must go is also emphasised by the use of an additional word that you don't really need for the meaning to be conveyed. So day.
Yes, that necessity, it's almost in the sense of the must is strong there, that he must, that it's a necessity. People call this like a divine necessity.
Yeah, so that alongside exposing your eyes, like seeing, this radical new truth that you need to grasp.
Yeah.
He must go. So I think I found that helpful.
Yeah, and even in English, I think that the show is intriguing because most of what we get is, well, it's either the narrative voice or we do have some direct speech from Jesus, or quoted speech from Jesus. But it's interesting to me that the verb is this showing rather than telling. It's not he went to tell them.
That's
what
true.
And so I guess even as a theme to think about, what does it mean to show Christianity, to show discipleship, as opposed to tell.
There is a lot of telling that goes on, but that's interesting and deliberate. We didn't talk about that in the Greek session, but
it's like that classic, I don't know who said it first, but preach the gospel everywhere, and if necessary, use words.
Kind
of thing.
So that was the only immediate thing. I was just wondering, I mean, the word Satan conjures up lots of resistance, for understandable reasons, because it's been personalised or into a little gremlin and all of that.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether you wanted to say anything about translations for that word.
The word there is satana, so it is Satan. By the time we get to the New Testament, I think it's appropriate for the translators to have capitalised it, because it becomes a title of a kind of evil figure. In Mark's Gospel, Satan and Beelzebub are used interchangeably. So, but what we get to by the New Testament, we have a more developed sense, this dualistic worldview that comes from an apocalyptic Judaism that does show sort of Jesus or the forces of good against the forces of evil. But of course, Satan in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament is a very different figure. In Job, Satan is part of, it's actually the Satan, the accuser, the prosecutor, we might say, is part of the heavenly court of God and is allowed to test Job.
Yes, of course, yes.
Yeah. And in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, there is the Satan, who again is like the accuser. But the tradition develops in the intertestamental Second Temple period that Satan becomes a fallen angel. Someone who was once in the heavenly divine realm, who is now part of the kind of demonic world.
Right.
I think to get the gist of this, we don't necessarily need to imagine an actual individualized devil.
Well, I think that would be unhelpful.
Yes. And probably theologically a bit,
dubious.
Naive. But we can't escape that in the Gospels there is a very real sense of the forces of evil and death. I mean, Paul will talk about it as, sin and death are like literally agents that act upon us.
And certainly, living in the world, I think it's naive almost not to have that sort of understanding. To deny that atrocious things don't happen. And
yes.
I know.
Yeah, that evil
suffering doesn't, But just briefly on the point of the apocalyptic worldview, I was interested here that the lectionary lopped out verse 27, which actually is the apocalyptic context for this. So leave that open to people whether you want to include that.
It is interesting because, in a sense, the verses we've been given you can stop at verse 26 and you've got a neat story. But actually, in talking about the Son of Man, Jesus is again taking it to that apocalyptic, the future expectation, both glory and judgment, which are strong themes in Matthew. So
sort of the cosmic reach of this. And, we're talking about the church here, really, in the person of Peter.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think let's talk about this denial. This is this classic verse about, if anyone want to be my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. And then Jesus goes on about saving a life and, what benefit is that? I must say I find these verses difficult. Luke will spiritualize them. He talks about taking up your cross daily. As if it's a spiritual thing, whereas I think Mark probably means it quite literally, like you must be prepared to suffer and die. But there's a problematic history here of the way we've talked about denial and suffering.
Well, because it's loaded on a certain group of minorities more than
I think so.
Others. I mean, I suppose, what it's not saying here is if, denying yourself means to live, you'll live a better life if you live an unselfish life. I mean, that's too shallow. That there is a lot more being said here about your identity and your orientation, I think, towards God.
I think so, yeah. So for me, this is tricky stuff to preach, because I think it is about getting the balance between a certain amount of the demands of discipleship are that it is sometimes about denying our own selfish desires, our own personal goals for something God might be calling us to do. That the life of a disciple and following Jesus might lead us to places where we suffer as a result. The consequences of leading a Jesus way of life. So I don't want to deny that or talk it away, which seems to be something that the middle class church has done too easily.
And interestingly too, what does it mean for the church to say that? Like, we can talk about ourselves and our own discipleship. What does it mean for the church to just deny the church's self?
Yeah.
From this passage. But go on, because I believe you've been reading a book that...
So I've been reading this great book called Call and Consequences by a womanist scholar in America called Raquel St. Clair. And she wants to honour the fact that suffering and the cross of Jesus is right at the heart of Black Christianity. The cross, James Cohen talks about this in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. There's such a strong association with Jesus' suffering and death in the experience of African American people. But she does name that for Black women, there has been a sort of a double level of suffering that's just been heaped on them in terms of oppression, partly because of their colour, partly because of their gender. And then economic and other factors in there too, when you have systemic racism and oppression. And she distinguishes, I think, quite helpfully between suffering that is the byproduct of oppression, which she says is not Christian. We should be calling out oppression.
Yeah, and that's not the cross we're being asked to take up. That is, And
suffering that's the result, to quote her, suffering that is the result of challenging the sources of one's oppression. So I think here, she doesn't name him, but the sort of the Martin Luther King Jr. tradition where, he was ultimately assassinated and paid the ultimate price, but it was precisely for challenging non-gospel oppressive behaviours.
Yeah.
Not because he just sought to be martyred for the sake of martyr. Does that? How do you make sense of this stuff theologically?
I think one way to look at this is take up your cross. I need to have another read of it. Take up your cross. If you want to deny yourselves and take up your cross. So let the cross that you take up be the one that's defined by Jesus' cross, not what the world might define as a cross, which in the instance of this author sounds like is the oppression.
Yes.
So it's and that here means, that's where the crux of the story, the foundational story for us, isn't it? If you take up this radical freedom that God offers, you end up going to the place of unfreedom, which is Jerusalem. So you encounter, your life is to challenge what the world says is freedom, or what the world says is true, or what the world says is good, and that is a cross to carry if you're going to do that, and it's profoundly costly.
But the irony, which is named in the verses that follow, or the liberating irony, is that in that process, we often find true life. So that juxtaposition of life and death is that often in what might seem anti-life is where we find the true spark of life.
Yeah, I was leaping ahead a bit here, and I shouldn't, because it was about, the fact that, we do find true life, but then there's a reality that, like Martin Luther King Jr. didn't himself. He saw the promised land. He said he saw it, but he didn't get there. And I'm thinking of Moses' life right at the end. He's told you're not going to get there. You're not going to.
No, he dies.
So there's something about the costliness also being in you are doing it for God's sake.
Yes.
Not for your sake. Not because God needs you to do it, but because, I don't know.
God's people do.
Yeah, God's
right.
people do.
It's about more than the individual, I think, in both those examples.
Mm.
We should turn to Exodus. So in chapter 3, we encounter Moses as an adult. All of a sudden, he's in Midian territory near Mount Horeb, so he's at distance. He's married, and he's working in the fields looking after the flocks of his father-in-law. And the bit we've skipped is that story of Moses, who's grown up in this Egyptian household, seeing the cruelty of an Egyptian towards a Hebrew slave and intervening and killing this Egyptian man and therefore fleeing. So it's interesting whether he had some natural sense of injustice or some sense that the Hebrew people were his people, but he's now with the Midianites.
Yeah, or it's the author saying, I mean, this is why this is the man chosen to do this task.
Because he'll stand up for injustice. Yeah. So it's a shame we've skipped that, but it is a...
It's also, I also think it's important to remember, just in terms of that, this is someone chosen by God, but who is capable of that. I mean,
Yeah, who's just done violence.
Major, but like the worst, taking someone's life.
Yes. Which in other parts of Scripture will be harshly condemned. You don't get to live if you've taken a life. But, so it's part of that imperfect people called. And this is both a theophany in terms of it's revealing something profound about God, and it's a call story.
Yeah.
So God is...
And you could easily preach just on one of those aspects of the text.
I think so. You might have to pick.
Yeah.
So should we sort of go through this a bit? There's a bush burning. We all know about the burning bush. It's supernatural, and that's what grabs Moses' attention.
Yeah. I was wondering if fire is used very frequently in imagery biblically before this. I couldn't think of anything, but...
Probably not before this, but it's interesting that the fire is associated at first with an angel coming down. So in verse 2 it talks about an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of a bush that's burning. And later on in, say, Isaiah, where we get the seraphim and stuff, which are often just, we think of as pretty little white fluffy winged angels. I mean, they're fiery creatures.
Yeah, right.
So fire is associated with angels, I think, in some of these traditions. And, of course, then God arrives and says he's on holy ground and calls to him, and we get that classic Moses response to a calling, the prophetic response, which is Hineni, here I am.
Here I am.
And then a great revealing of...
Yeah, I mean, for me, this passage is, I think I could almost say that if I can't not preach on this aspect of it when I'm asked to preach, which is the revelatory, theophanic aspect of the passage, which is God declaring who God is. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And also I'm reminded of just this week watching an interview with Joel Baden, the Hebrew scholar, about the I am, when God declares I am here. Joel suggests it's a playfulness, bit of a pun on God's part, because Yahweh actually means he who causes to be in the third person. So, of course, if God's going to be asked who God is, God will turn it around. I am who I am.
Yeah, that's right. I am. And the verbal form here can even be a future, so it can be like, I'll be who I'll be kind of thing.
Well,
it's cheeky.
Joel said it was something like, I would have been who I could have been. Like he was talking about.
It's basically not very translatable.
No, which I think is profoundly important for us to remember, that in our grammar and language about God, we have the first key identifier is actually a mystery, is mysterious to us. I think that's...
Yes, it becomes a name, that precious name. I try not to say, because there are many Jews who won't utter the name of God, but it's the Yahweh name, which is particular for the God of the Hebrews. And it's what distinguishes them from other religions around them that have different names for God. So God's generic, but Yahweh is their God. It's the precious name that they know. but yeah, there's a mystery in the heart of it. It's not a name in the typical sense. It's a
verb too. That's what I'm really struck by.
Action.
The action and the dynamic character of God that comes through here. Well, the God of history, because we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I was just struck this time studying this passage, how many things God did. I have observed the misery. I've heard the cry. I know their sufferings. I came down to deliver them. I brought them up or bring them up out of the land. He says, I
will do this.
The oppression, I'll send you to Pharaoh and I will be with you. Yes. And I suspect, I know that is a deeply radical way to characterise God.
But it points to the same profound truth we saw in the Matthew passage, which is that we really know who God is through God's action. So like the name becomes, in a sense, a side note, a footnote, because just like Jesus, showed who the Messiah would be, and it's embodied in this willingness to go to a cross and die, and then for God to raise him from the dead. Like God is known in that action just as God is known in this action. And in the biblical tradition, this actually becomes the pivotal story of God choosing God's people. So you think of later biblical writers, and they will talk about God as, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is the God that they know, the liberating God who did this thing.
And for us, the God who raised Jesus from the dead. And I'm reminded too, Fleming Rutledge has a sermon on this passage in her book, And God Spoke to Abraham, and she talks about the most interesting names for God emerge when God's history interacts with ours. That history indicated by those names of those particular people. But also in those actions of hearing and responding and hearing cries and coming.
And to me too, this reveals something about the character of God in a God that has seen and noted and is attentive to the suffering and oppression of God's people. And then, has a plan to do something about it, and that plan involves working with human beings. Like I'm always staggered how often in the Bible, if we assume theologically God is capable of doing anything, and yet God chooses to work through and with human beings despite all their frailty.
And I think a really important point to make here is that this God seeing and hearing and responding and subsequent deliverance of his people, this is all happening before God gives the people the law later on the same mountain. So it's not conditional. There's actually a deeply gracious movement going on here, which I think is often undersold in the Hebrew scriptures or denied outright.
And I think that's what Joel Baden is referring to in his Exodus book, which I mentioned last week too, in that so this idea I was just referring to, that this is the pivotal kind of story of God choosing this people, is that God is doing this before the people have agreed to adhere to the law or any of those other later covenantal relationships. So it is that profound grace towards a group of people who are oppressed and of course we should very briefly mention in the New Testament this Yahweh name, which in the Greek translation of the Old Testament becomes ego eimi, I am. Is what Jesus uses, or the Gospel of John will use, put in Jesus' mouth as part of his self-revelation. So we often know that version of it in Christianity.
Yeah.
Other themes here, Fran? I was struck by the holy ground thing, going back to where we were before. The taking off your sandals is a ritual thing. Lots of current religious groups do it. Muslims take off shoes before going in a mosque. But the ground here is just regular ground until God arrives. So we see here again the movement of God towards and into human lives, not Moses finding God or Moses even looking for God.
Well, no, I think that's one of the more important aspects of this. We've made this point in the podcast before. I don't think you can make it too many times, that God comes in search of us, like God went looking for Adam, who hid himself in the bush after they ate the fruit.
Yes.
Here God is coming for Moses.
Yep. And it just struck me when so many people are away from their normal worshipping communities, and I'm all for having designated sacred spaces, which are kind of what churches and mosques and synagogues and cathedrals are, places we set aside for particular activities. And I think they're important, but perhaps not always as important as we make them. And this story reminds us that it is the presence of God that makes something holy. So when we're worshipping at home or in haphazard ways at the moment, it's the presence of God that makes that holy space, not us needing to go to a particular location.
I also like the point that I read briefly about this holy ground, that it does echo back to Genesis, where we come from the dust, and to the dust we shall return, and where the growing things grew and so on. I think that's a good reflection as well around the significance of the holy ground.
Yep, I think that's right. There's one problem I want to name in this text, which we're not going to have time to unpack, but part of the promise of God to take the people into this land that's characterized as flowing with milk and honey, which are symbols of luxury in the Bible. Milk and honey are occasional precious things. It's like caviar and champagne of the ancient world. It's to the country that's named in verse 8 that already belongs to the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, etc., etc. So I just want to be cognizant that we're talking about a story from the perspective of the Israelites, but the land they're being promised already belongs to someone.
To someone else.
So they become colonizers of someone else's land. And this is a big theological problem, I think, in the Bible.
And Joel Bowden also refers to this when, they're liberated from slavery, but then they are liberated to have slaves themselves.
Yes.
So, the conversation I was, the interview about that was, clearly this is a text of its time and so on, and it's not suggesting a revolutionary overthrowing of the social structures.
No.
But we do need to be mindful.
Just careful in the way we talk about that, particularly in the Australian context, where we too, for the most part, unless you're Indigenous, are also, colonisers of a land that belonged to another people, but was declared, for England. Yeah.
I had a thought I have had a thought just now about, where we're worshipping remotely, and the milk and the honey here. I'm reminded of a retreat for ministers I helped to run with a few of the colleagues, including Stephen Burns, our liturgist colleague, a couple of years ago, where we actually shared communion as milk and honey. And it just occurs to me that, most homes have got milk and honey in them. There's a sort of a riff on a communion you could have using those elements, perhaps.
A kind of special meal that's...
special meal, not communion, of course, but a recognition of the story.
Yes, and the preciousness of these gifts of God. We're almost out of time, but I think... I don't know if you have any last words to say, Fran. I think for me there's a wonderful thread in the readings today about the way God is revealed in God's action, as we've said. That even though we have these names, whether it's Messiah or Yahweh or the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, God is known through what God does. And also for humans.
And just the theme, as I think I indicated earlier in the conversation, the theme that echoes between Moses and Peter here, which is the call to follow God, to take the cross, or whatever language you use, is a call into a radical freedom from oppressive aspects of the world, but it will lead you to those. It will lead you to oppression.
Yes.
In lots of instances.
As you challenge oppression.
As you challenge the worldly oppression. The costliness to that.
Yeah, in both these stories, there's costliness for Moses and his family too. And
they do it for God's sake and the people's sake.
Well, thank you, Fran, and thank you everyone for listening to By the Well. Until next week.
Next time.